One. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Welsh Republic podcast, episode 162 today, and I'm here with a very special guest, Rachel Blevins. How are you doing today, Rachel?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. So, Rachel, what have you been up to today? Anything much? And how's stuff going over there in Texas with you?
You know, it's good in Texas. We are getting at least our version of a cold front, which is to say I'm here in Austin, in the capital of Texas, and it has been very, very warm. So we're finally just getting into some sort of almost autumn weather, I would say, where you've got the leaves finally starting to change. It's catching up with the rest of the world. And so far, it's been a good day. I mean, I put together a new video that I have out on my channel talking about the current situation in Syria, getting into some of the latest reports there. And it's been interesting because this is a conflict that I've been covering for the last decade. And yet still, when I see these updates, I know we'll get into it a little bit more, but it still surprises me, right? I still look at the latest and go, how in the world did we get here? And I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse to still have that feeling so often, so long into it.
So, I mean, I agree. I think it is very tragic what's going on in Syria, and for Assad to leave, after being such a good leader, it is pretty tragic. But before we get on to that, Rachel, so tell me about yourself. Like, a bit about your background. We can talk about we can talk about this for a bit, and then get on to some other stuff. But speaking about that, so Rachel, what got you into journalism? How long have you been an independent journalist? Tell us about your background and what was it like to work for RT News America?
Yeah. So I'm actually from Texas originally. I graduated as a valedictorian of my high school class. And in Texas, that guarantees you one free year at a state college. And so I kind of had it lined up. I didn't know what I was going to school for, but I knew I was going for at least 1 year. And I ended up choosing journalism as a major initially because I really like to write. I was not planning to do anything on camera, on TV, anything like that. I just knew that I enjoyed writing. And so I got into it. And luckily, one thing I'm grateful for, I went to Texas Tech University, and our first journalism class, the professor was very honest, right? He sits down with everybody and he goes, look, you're going to get a piece of paper that's going to say you have a degree in journalism, and it's not really going to be worth much unless you work really, really hard. You are going to, end up at some local TV station or some local newspaper struggling to get by for years until maybe you might get a shot at making it into, some national network or really climbing the ladder. It's really difficult in the mainstream media. And so I found myself kind of in this place where I was looking around going, well, I'm in this position, going into school, taking on student debt. If I get this degree, I've got to make it worth it, right? I've got to do something that's going to have some sort of return on my investment. And I also realized at the same time, they would talk so much about Fox News being on the right and CNN being on the left. And myself politically, I didn't feel like I fit into any box, right? I didn't agree with Republicans or Democrats or even a lot of the third parties. And I was going, okay, well, I'm kind of in this weird independent gray area when it comes to how I see the world. And so I started looking more into alternative media, what other options were out there. RT was a big option at the time. RT America existed at the time back in 2014. And one of the big stories that was going on in the summer of 2014 was, of course, Israel and what at the time was its unprecedented assault on the Gaza Strip, targeting the Palestinian people there. And I noticed in particular that the media coverage here in the US was so slanted, right? They were showing it from Israel's perspective. They were not showing it from the perspective of the Palestinians or anything that they were going through. And I realized that when you look into the other alternative media, other independent journalists that were out there at the time, they were the ones who were actually talking about it, right? They were the ones who were covering these stories. And so I was able to kind of see that difference and go, okay, I want to be one of those people, right? I want to be one of the people who's actually challenging the narrative, covering the stories that just are not getting coverage on the mainstream media. I don't want to be the person who's just, parroting the talking points that you're sent and then having to work in one of these local stations where, I mean, I interned with them, and a lot of the people there are not very happy. It's not exactly a great environment. In a lot of cases, I know there's still a lot of people that do love their jobs in local news. But yeah, I started reaching out to some of the, unfortunately, a lot of the alternative media websites that were out there in 2014 and 2015 don't exist anymore because of big tech censorship, and they've all kind of fallen apart. So at the time, there was enough of a kind of network out there that I was able to start writing, start getting freelance work, and really just kind of build my platform on social media. And then in 2016, I then started building my YouTube channel, started creating videos similar to the ones that I still do right now, because I kind of realized, we're moving into this world where everything is visual, right? Everyone wants to see the video. They don't want to just sit there and read the 3,000 word essay that I've written out. That's all fine and good. But a lot of people would rather watch someone talking to them and watch kind of what they have to say and be brought into the story that is being told. And so I started looking at the videos that I was creating as a way to take that research, take that writing that I was already doing, and then put it into a video format, write scripts for videos. And then I was able to kind of really up my skills when it came to video editing. And so a lot of the work that I currently do, I'm doing that all myself, right? I'm doing all of the writing, the research, the editing, and then the publishing and kind of sharing the videos out there. And those were skills that I really started in college. But then once I get to the end of this 4-year process, right, as I mentioned, I'm in this position looking at taking on, I'm going, okay, I've got student loan debt, I've got a piece of paper, and the journalism landscape in the alternative media in 2017 was really, really tough, because that's when big tech had started to crack down. So a lot of these freelance writing jobs and different gigs that I was getting, they were just kind of drying up. And I was looking around going, okay, what is one of the main networks out there? Oh, well, it's RT. And luckily, I'd had some kind of back and forth with RT America based out of Washington, D.C. And I was very fortunate that when I ended up reaching out to them come 2018, after struggling my way through freelance writing for a year and just kind of getting to the point where I said, okay, I've got to change things up and do something different, I was fortunate that RT America was hiring at the time. They flew me out. They offered me a job as a reporter. I was not great at the beginning. I will be the first person to say that, right? I had no experience reading a teleprompter, being on camera, all of these different things that you don't really think about that are still very important to that job. I did not have that experience whatsoever. So it definitely took some time. I'm very grateful that they took a chance on me, right? That they gave me that opportunity to work for them and to get to cover stories that I was passionate about. I mean, I remember my first week there, one of the reports that I got to cover was on Yemen and on the humanitarian crisis there. And that's something that the mainstream media just was not talking about. So I was at RT America for almost 5 years until they shut down in 2022. And it was a really interesting experience. I learned a lot. I had the first few years that I worked as a reporter, so I was covering a lot of US foreign policy. I was also out on the street, if you had Black Lives Matter protests were really big then, so I was out covering those. I was out as close as we could get to the White House because they wouldn't let RT have any White House press credentials, unfortunately. So I was out there, outside of the White House covering whatever foreign leader was coming to meet with what at the time was the Trump administration. And then for the last couple of years at RT America, I was a co-host on their business, technology, and economic show Boom Bust. And so that was really a challenge because I'm someone who is coming from a foreign policy background, right? I'm talking about all of the wars that the US is getting into. And then I'm getting to work on this show where I'm talking about the US economy and inflation. And at the time we were in the midst of COVID. And so talking about how the governments around the world are printing all of this money out of thin air and how that's impacting everything. And so it was really kind of a fascinating project to get to work on. And then it unfortunately came to a very abrupt end on March 3rd, 2022. And that was a really tough time. I mean, the people that I worked with at RT America, they were genuinely like family to me, right? I loved going into office every day, getting to see all of these people, and having that all come to an end. And obviously it was just about a little over a week after you had the war starting in Ukraine, and you had just this onslaught from the mainstream media, from the US government and everything, targeting RT and acting as if they were blaming them for everything. And so we had RT America at the time, the production company that ran everything. They were the ones who decided to shut down. And so I found myself once again in this place of going, okay, I've got to, recalibrate, figure out what I'm doing next. And at the time, RT International in Moscow, they were reaching out going, okay, we need people here. Would you be interested in possibly coming to Moscow and working here for a year? And, it just kind of lined up timeline wise with when my apartment lease in DC was coming to an end and that was, when I would be leaving for Moscow. And I said, you know what, I'm going to take on this adventure, something I would not normally do. I'm not, one to really get out of my comfort zone, especially when it comes to travel. And so I agreed to go there for a year. And yeah, that was truly an adventure. And it was so interesting to me to get to see a part of the world where so many in the US, especially the US government and the media here, they act as if Moscow is this closed off place, right? They tell you what they want you to think of Russia. They always show its grayest, sort of darkest days, which it does have some gray days, but there's a lot that they leave out there. And so getting to be there for a year, getting to have the experience of meeting so many new people was truly such a blessing. It's something I'm grateful for. I still have people that I met there that I, talk to on a regular basis. And so it really was a cool experience to get to go through for a year. And then I've been back here for, I guess about a year and a half now, back in Texas, spending some time with family, right? Trying to be a little bit closer to family for a period now that I've been gone for a year and getting to come back home, and kind of just back to creating regular videos and trying to follow everything that's going on in the world, and really hoping that we don't go to World War III. And that about brings me to where I am right now.
Rachel, being a journalist yourself, who would you say was, as a in your life when you were being young till now, who has been your one famous journalist that you've really looked up to, that's really helped you to, when you've been feeling down and out, that you looked up to, that helped you never give up on journalism? And what would you say that has been your favorite interview that you've done out of any interview you've done, and your favorite story that you've covered? Go ahead.
Oh, that's an interesting question. As far as, I don't know. I honestly do not know if I have just one journalist that I've looked up to. That's a really, there's so many out there. I think when I was getting into it, it was interesting because I very quickly learned that journalists are kind of like politicians, right? I think a lot of times we want to idolize a politician. We want to think, oh, this is, if you're looking at someone running for president, this is the person I'm looking up to. This is the person I agree with them on everything. And as you find with politicians, a lot of times there may be some things you do agree with them on, but there's also probably a lot that you don't agree with them on. And so that was kind of how I found it when it came to the journalists that were in the field, that still are in the field, right? I'm looking around going, okay, there may be some people where I really agree with them on certain things, but not so much on others. And I think I found, getting into it, journalists are just people too at the end of the day, right? Do not ever idolize a journalist or a politician or think that anyone is any kind of stature, right? At the end of the day, they are just your regular people. And As far as the interviews that I've done, that's actually a really good question. I'm trying to think if I have any kind of favorite or any standout. I mean, I do. It's funny because when I cover a lot of foreign policy stories, I interview a lot of guys, right? I get a lot of men on there, and it's very the women that I get to talk to are much fewer in number. Unfortunately, I wish it was different. I wish there were more of a mix, but I think one of my favorite people to talk to is always Lebanese journalist Mara Osman, because she comes on and she just has so much fire, right? It's impossible to be bored when you're talking to her. She just has this kind of sass in the way that she tells a story, and just her passion about it is just infectious. And she's talking about what she's living through. Obviously, she's there in Beirut. She has young children. She's been through so much, going through so much. And so it's just inspiring to get to talk to her, to hear her story, and to hear everything that she has been through along the way. Another favorite, which I do have him on pretty frequently, is Mark Sloboda. And he lives in Moscow, right? He was formerly in the US, formerly part of the US military. And I think what I enjoy about him is that he is ever the pessimist. So even in some stories where I'm coming in and I'm going, okay, this is going to change, right? This is going to be different. Don't you think so? And he's there, no. And he's usually right about it, right? He's usually the one who is the realist when everyone else is looking at it and going, okay, don't you think that this is going to happen or this war is going to end? He's usually the one kind of bringing everyone back to earth. He's definitely done that when it comes to the incoming Trump administration and, looking at Trump's cabinet picks. And I think a lot of people had high hopes that it was going to be different this time around, right? That Trump was going to learn his...
Very pro-Israel, pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like you kind of see with Trump's cabinet for his second term, oh, this is how it's going to go. This is exactly how it's going to be. And I think that, when it comes to interviews, and I'm sure you have a version of this experience on your end since you do interviews on your show, but one thing I find is how much I learned, even all of the reading and the research. I'll get guests on and they'll be talking about a current situation, whether it's in Ukraine and Gaza and Syria, and they're telling me things that I have not even considered, that I was not aware of. And it's just so cool to get to learn more and more on a daily basis, and also to realize, hey, I don't know it all. I don't have it all figured out. And I'm more than happy to get to learn from the people around me. And that includes sometimes not having it fully figured out, not getting it fully correct. And it is a good lesson. I think it definitely teaches me to not be too definite with my predictions, right? Not to say, oh, this is going to happen and that's going to happen, because the truth is, I don't know. I'm just here trying to, figure it out along with everyone else.
So right now, as we all know, Syria, obviously, the government of Assad, he's been retreated. He's now resigned. He's no longer the president of Syria, which is very heartbreaking because he was a great leader for Syria and defended Syria a lot from the Western imperialists and a lot from the Zionist oligarch elite too. In your opinion, from what you've learned about what's happening in Syria, what is your opinion of seeing Assad fall? What do you think are the facts that people should know about the Syrian rebels that you won't hear from the Western media? Go ahead. From the things you've studied. Okay.
Yeah. Well, first I will just say I was shocked to see Bashar al-Assad not only step down, but flee the country, right? To hear that he was on a plane going to Russia, I believe on late Saturday, early Sunday, at least in the US, was when we started getting that news. And it was interesting because following Syria for the last decade, you've seen these quote unquote so-called rebel groups, right? You've seen ISIS, you've seen Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra Front, all of these various extremist groups, or as the US wants to call them, moderate groups. You've kind of seen them ebb and flow, but the entire time you've seen the Syrian government stand strong. And starting back in 2015, a big reason why Assad and his government were able to stand strong was because of Russia, was because Russia came in and said, no, we're not doing this when it comes to the US and Turkey, essentially, right? They said, no, we're actually going to fight ISIS. We're going to get Turkey to pull back on its, funding and enabling of extremists in the region. And Russia really made a statement there. But for the US, that made them incredibly frustrated. And they never forgot about the fact that they were not successful in overthrowing Assad. And even though, we did have a ceasefire agreement between Russia and Turkey back in 2020. And that's when you saw these extremists in this latest group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. They were then confined to Idlib in northwestern Syria. And it seemed as though for a few years that things were calm, right? In the sense that you didn't have a major extremist group, jihadist group, whatever you want to call it, advancing on Aleppo and Homs and Hama and these other really key cities in Syria. And so to watch the way that things have evolved in the last 2 weeks, it has been really shocking. Yes, right. I was one of the first to go, wait a second, Assad is leaving, right? I absolutely did not expect that. But at the same time, when I start to really dig into it and to look back, I'm going, okay, well, as the US, to be fair, they said it. They said, look, the backers, the allies of Assad and his government, they have a lot of other things going on right now that they didn't have in 2015 or even 2020. You've got Russia, they're now dealing with an entire proxy war with NATO at their doorstep. You've got Iran dealing with various attacks from Israel. You've got Hezbollah now dealing with Israel, literally targeting Lebanon, even continuing to bomb Lebanon, even though they're supposed to be in a ceasefire right now. And so all of these other allies that back in 2015, they were able to drop everything and say, okay, we're going to come to your side. We're going to back up Syria and protect its people. They're now in a position where they may not be able to do that. And obviously, we don't know what was said behind closed doors. We don't know if there were conversations had where Russia was the one saying, look, I'm sorry, this is how much help we can give you, and it's not likely to be enough. At the same time, we also don't know if Assad was the one saying, look, I'm deciding that I'm done. I, realize that I'm asking too much of all of these different countries that now have conflicts going on in their own backyard or at home. And so when it comes down to it, I think you also have the factor there with how different relations have played out, I would say, in the last year. Because one of the things about Russia, I would agree, I've gotten some comments from people who have mentioned the fact that Turkey kind of seems to be Russia's blind spot to a certain extent, which is to say that Turkey is this country that they constantly try to play the middle of the field, right? They're a member of NATO, but at the same time, they're also acting like they're allies with Russia, but they're also acting like they're, on the side of, well, Turkey at the end of the day, but they are always kind of back and forth. And Russia has looked at them. They know that Turkey has been a key ally to them in the face of all of these sanctions that have come from the West. I mean, when I traveled to Moscow, I was not able to go through London, right? Because all of those flight routes have since been canceled. I instead had to go through Turkey. I went through Istanbul. That was the easiest route to get to Moscow. So you have Russia in this position where they know that they don't want to just sever ties with Turkey altogether, but they also know that Turkish President Erdogan and Bashar al-Assad in Syria, that these two leaders do not like each other. And that Erdogan has spent more than a decade actively trying to overthrow Assad. And so earlier this year, we did see Erdogan reach out and kind of say in a way that he would be willing to have in-person talks with Assad to, work on reconstructing their ties, whatever that looks like. And Assad's response to that was to say no. His response to that was to say, we will not have talks until Turkish troops get out of Syrian territory, right? He's saying, get off my land. And I do think that that kind of a response to Erdogan almost kind of made him double down in a way of saying, okay, well, if you're not going to talk with me, if you're not going to do what I want, then I'm going to show you, right? I'm going to unleash this offensive of these Al-Qaeda extremists on your country. And it's going to present a very serious problem because, as we've seen in the last 2 weeks, while HTS is this coordinated group, they're all working together. They've got this apparent shadow government that they were running in Idlib that they were then preparing to unleash on Damascus. Well, the Syrian government and military was all spread out. So they weren't nearly ready for what was coming to them. And while, yes, there could have been a lot more fighting than there was. I mean, we saw a lot of places where Syrian troops stood down. They were told to stand down and to not fight. Assad had to know that that fighting, if it occurred, would come at a very serious price, a price that would cost Syria even more, as it has already gone through, 13 years of crushing sanctions, dealing with so much from the West. And so, I look at this, and in a lot of ways I'm going, okay, Russia, this is not good for you, right? To lose Assad, to lose a key ally in Syria, that's not good for you. It gives Turkey infinitely more power. And at the end of the day, Turkey is not on Russia's side, no matter what they are telling Russia. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the coming weeks. But yeah, a lot of shock, a lot of kind of searching for, as you were noting there, those facts at the end of the day, because the mainstream media is filled with so much propaganda. I mean, they are coming out with all of these stories, the claims about Assad, these claims that the white helmets, again, affiliated with Al-Qaeda, that they're back again, that they're discovering these horrific prison tunnels, and God knows what else they are throwing in there. But it is interesting to see the media treatment of this when, at the end of the day, the Syrian people do not benefit from the current situation. They do not benefit from this chaos, from these Al-Qaeda affiliates now being unleashed on the country, trying to form this new version of a transitional government. I mean, we're already seeing the horrific and gruesome videos that are just the ones that have been put on social media in the last 24 hours. And it causes a lot of concern for the Syrian civilians who have already been through so much, who now are looking at a new reality, and it still is not good for them.
Rachel, what is your thoughts? Two questions here. What is your thoughts on the people right now, like pro-Palestinian supporters, who are fighting for Palestine and say Palestine should be liberated, but at the same time, those people who support Palestine are yet against Assad, a guy who has done so much for the Palestinian cause? And yet, what is your thoughts on these pro-Palestinians, who are supporting Palestine, but yet supporting the Syrian rebels who are backed by the CIA and Mossad? And one question here is what impact do you think this is regionally going to have in Syria for the next few years? Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me. I think those people are a bit confused, right? I think that they are buying a bit too much of the propaganda that's being put out there. And it's important to remember, just because it's being presented to you as a resistance group, as a rebellion, does not make it so. And I think the fact that we've watched as these extremist groups have been labeled as rebels, right? If you look at the current situation in the Donbass region, for example, the people there who said that they were breaking away from the Kiev regime after, their democratically elected government in Ukraine was overthrown with help from the West, the people in the Donbass who said, you know what, no, I'd rather form my own independent republic than to have to deal with whatever the West is supporting in Kiev. When it came to how the mainstream media referred to them, they called them separatist, right? They called them militants. They did not call them rebels. But then when you look at Syria, the reason that they call these guys rebels doesn't matter what ties they have to Al-Qaeda or ISIS or how, extreme their beliefs are when it comes to how much of a jihadist they are at the end of the day. What matters is that they are rebelling against the media's version of a dictator, which that's exactly how they presented Bashar al-Assad, was this evil dictator. Therefore, anyone rising up against him must be some kind of righteous rebel. And so you do get a lot of people who say, oh, well, you know, I support the Palestinians. They're rising up against the oppression that they are facing from Israel, and rightfully so. But then they try to apply that same blueprint to Syria and to say, oh, well, these protesters here, they must also be rising up against oppression here, not really paying attention to the fact that, exactly as you noted there, these people all have foreign intervention when it comes to Syria, right? There's plenty of foreign influence there from the US, from Turkey, from Israel, just to name really the key members there. Whereas in Palestine, you're dealing with people that are fighting for their lives, fighting just to stay alive, let alone fighting for their land. And so I can see how people get it mixed up. I kind of wish that they paid more attention to the way that the media is presenting this, because I think that that tells you everything that you need to know at the end of the day. When it comes to where Syria goes from here, right? What this means for Syria in the coming years. I know that there's a lot of concern right now that it could become the next Libya, where you have this constant infighting. Obviously, you've had 13 years now of all of this foreign intervention, all of these different groups fighting each other. And the US and Turkey and Israel, they've wanted those groups to fight, right? They've wanted there to be that violence. And so even though all of these different groups had a common cause in terms of trying to overthrow Assad, well, now he's gone. So now they're fighting it out for power. So there is a lot of concern that, you know, you get this current transitional government in Damascus that HTS is heading up and putting together. Well, what happens if the Kurds over in northern Syria decide, hey, we decide that we are the rightful government of Syria, right? We're going to have our own version. And then you get kind of a Libya-like scenario where you have these rivaling governments that are just constantly fighting with each other. That's a major concern. You also have the concern of the fact that we could become a situation much like Lebanon, where you have a government, right, that is recognized as the government of Syria, and then you also have other factions there, other groups there, maybe even a group there that becomes as powerful as Hezbollah is in Lebanon, to where it's a very significant factor. And I think it'll be interesting to see exactly how that turns out. Also, if we get a lifting of the sanctions, if we have an Afghanistan situation where you have countries like the US just flooding the country with all of this money, all of this, aid. And of course, you have all of these people who have been under such strict sanctions for the last 13 years that now they're receiving this flooding of foreign aid. And the results of that is a lot of corruption, right? It's getting to the point where it's not manageable for that country. And I think my biggest concerns are, at the end of the day, for the average civilians, right? Their interests are not being taken into account. You have all of these foreign countries that are kind of playing chess with these different militant groups across Syria. And then at the same time, you also have Israel now moving in. I mean, they have wasted no time whatsoever. They have automatically gone in. I believe the latest tally was up to 480 strikes that Israel has carried out targeting Syria. They are very clearly trying and targeting successfully Syria's air defenses, Syria's naval fleet. They're making it so that if the Syrian Arab army that existed under Assad, if they want to come back together and form a force of their own, that they have nothing to work with, that they have no way to defend themselves. On top of that, you also have you also have Israel, going further in invading Syrian territory, deciding that they are going to expand what they refer to as a buffer zone. And it's just so concerning to watch Israel really get away with this, right? To watch the international community. I know that we've gotten statements from countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and the UN Security Council is working on a strongly worded statement. And that's all fine and good. But at the end of the day, those statements are just words. The actions that we're seeing is that no one is doing anything. And the normal resistance that we would normally see in terms of Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, they are now the ones who are being targeted by Israel. It's targeting Hezbollah's supply lines coming through Syria. It's targeting, a number of ways in which Hezbollah would be receiving its support, now putting it in a position where it can't do anything. And so to me, watching the power trip that Israel is on right now is extremely concerning, because I'm going, okay, who's going to challenge them, right? Who's going to rein them in? We know that the U.S. isn't going to do it. I mean, the U.S. has stood by and enabled and funded and supported an ongoing genocide for more than a year now of the Palestinian people. So we know that the U.S. doesn't have a moral compass when it comes to Israel, but it's incredibly concerning to think about the reality of where this goes from here, how much Israel gets away with, and really who has the power to stop them at the end of the day. Because right now it feels as though they are just on this upward trajectory when it comes to their power trip, their free-for-all bombing spree, and they have the US backing them the entire way. And that is just incredibly concerning for the civilians on the ground at the end of the day.
Right now, a lot of people are saying that the axis of resistance has now been defeated, but a lot of people actually, there are still some of it left. When you look at this current situation, Rachel, with the world moving to the multipolar world and America losing its influence, and how there's a lot of people saying that America's going to collapse, the dollar's on its last legs, potentially a civil war. Do you think there's any way, because Israel, I mean, they're having their problems too. Benjamin Netanyahu is getting called out by a lot of his government officials and all that stuff, and he's in corruption, going to court because of some corruption charges. Do you see there being any way that the Greater Israel Project can be stopped? Or do you think even if America was to collapse and it was to enter into its own financial crisis, do you see any way of the Greater Israel Project being stopped or not? Like, is there any way for that to happen or not?
Yeah, I think when it comes down to it, if you look at the map of the Greater Israel Project, the one stopping point that I do think that they will run into is Saudi Arabia, right? You look at that map and you go, wait a second, Israel wants to take this massive chunk of Saudi Arabia's land. I don't personally see that happening. I think my hope is always, if I'm going to be optimistic at all, my hope is that you have Saudi Arabia, you have some of these other players in the region that finally kind of wake up and go, oh, Israel's not going to stop with Gaza, right? They may have thought initially, oh, let's just let Israel bomb the Gaza Strip as much as they want, kill as many Palestinians as they want. I mean, these other countries, the governments don't care, the people care, but the governments at the end of the day, it means nothing to them. But when they start to see Israel expand into Syria, as it's doing right now, right, continue to target Lebanon, and they start to wake up to the fact that, oh, wait a second, Israel wants a lot of land, right? They want all of Jordan. They want a sliver of Turkey, and it just keeps going and going. Then maybe they'll start to kind of realize, okay, this is not Israel has to be stopped. And if anything can give us hope, it's the fact that right now the US is an empire, and we know that empires tend to go too far, right? They tend to expand too much, to take on too much. And then finally, as you were noting, when it comes to this growing multipolar world, you have countries like Russia and like China that finally step in and say, okay, we're not going to continue on with this trajectory. This empire has to be reined in. Now, I don't think it's something that just happens overnight, right? I think it's going to be still a years-long process. I think that when it comes to the US and any talk of a civil war, I will say I'm a bit skeptical, because at the end of the day, the American people are lazy, right? What am I
Yeah.
going to do? Get up off my couch and go fight? No, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing and going to work every day. It's like the average American mindset is going, even right now when prices are soaring and Americans are taking on more debt than ever before and they're struggling to buy a home and, basic things that we try to achieve in our lifetime. Even as all of that's happening, I still think that the American people are comfortable enough that they're not really going to call for change, right? We're watching a genocide play out that the US government is enabling right now. And the American people are still kind of, iffy on whether they think that it's really happening or how much they really care. And that's always very telling to me as to how involved they are with the rest of the world, right? How much they're actually paying attention or going beyond just the mainstream media and what it's telling them. But beyond that, looking at this multipolar world, I do think that the loss of the Syrian government was a setback for that world. It was a setback for Russia. It was, watching the chaos that is going to be likely to continue to play out there. It does put us in a situation where we look and we go, okay, is the multipolar world ready to take on the issues that we currently have, right? If Russia and China and India and Saudi Arabia and Brazil, are they ready to actually challenge the US empire? And when we look at their treatment of Gaza, it doesn't feel as though they are, right? They're not stepping in and telling Israel, hey, we're going to cut all ties with you until you stop this. We're going to sanction you, exactly as the US would do to any country that it accused of any kind of human rights violations. The US would come in with sanctions. It would come in and target them in a number of ways. We're not seeing that happen. And so until the multipolar world, I believe, is ready to step up and to take on some of the biggest conflicts that being what's happening in Gaza, until they're ready to decide that, okay, we need to do everything that we can do to stop a genocide, then I still look at them and see the multipolar world kind of in its infancy. And I know that, when it comes to Russia, obviously, they're dealing with the war in Ukraine. They don't want to spread themselves too thin. They don't want to, go so far that they kind of bet it all and lose it all. And I think that that's understandable and that's respectable. But I still think we've got quite a ways to go at the end of the day. And the US and Israel are going to use as much time as they can, right? As much time as Israel is given to steal land from other countries, from other peoples, as much destruction as they can commit, they are going to do that. But I think the hope is always that eventually there will be a greater resistance, right? I know we do have a resistance right now. I know it's gone through a lot. You've seen Israel wipe out the entire political leadership of Hezbollah. They've wiped out the leadership of Hamas. So clearly they have made some gains in that area. But the resistance, for as long as Israel exists, for as long as it continues on with these crimes, there will always be a resistance. And so I do think that it will rise again, but I know that we're in for some dark days, at least in the short term.
That sounds pretty much it. Do you think that any decision will be taken against Israel before, it just annihilates Palestine?
I'm curious to see what decision would be made that would stop Israel, right? Because we've already seen they've got a pending case before the International Court of Justice for genocide. You've got the International Criminal Court coming out with an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. And so you see the places where international law is working to a certain extent. I think my biggest concern is that we've already seen the worst of the worst in Gaza, right? We've seen Israel carry out massacres that have been documented that are beyond belief. We've seen hospital patients burning to death in their beds because Israel just bombed the hospital that they were in. We've seen evidence that Israel is actively trying to just starve out around 400,000 Palestinians in the northern half of Gaza. And so being in a position where we've already seen Israel commit so many atrocities that I'm sitting there and going, okay, how much more are we going to take, right? How much worse is this going to get at the end of the day? I'm curious to see what the Trump administration does, not because I have any hope for it, which I definitely do not, looking at Trump and the very pro-Israel, pro-Zionist cabinet that he has appointed. However, I do still think there is a part of him that wants to come in and be the businessman and, quote unquote, bring some sort of peace deal. Now, my concern for the Palestinians, because the Gaza Strip has been effectively destroyed, it's been made unlivable by Israel, intentionally so. I think my biggest concern is that if Trump comes in and he says, okay, we're going to come up with some sort of deal and ceasefire plan, that's when Israel gets moving on. Okay, we're going to move X amount of Palestinians here. We're going to have this thousands go to this country as refugees. And they start really trying to move the Palestinians off of their land so that they can take control of it. Because at the end of the day, Israel wants that land. And so my concern going forward is, okay, what is Israel going to try to get away with? What are they going to get away with? Because up until this point, they have yet to be stopped, and they just keep going further and further. So I'm going, okay, the rest of the region, when are you guys going to wake up and see that you are going to be next at the end of the day? Exactly as we saw it with Russia being targeted by the US, by other Western countries with unprecedented sanctions, that made a lot of countries around the world wake up and go, wait a second, if the US is willing to target Russia, if they're willing to try to, suffocate Russia's economy and completely cut them off from the rest of the world, what's to stop them from targeting a much smaller, a much more insignificant country? Nothing is to stop them. So in this case, I really would hope, and maybe this is wishful thinking and I'm trying to speak it into existence, but I would hope that the other countries in the region, that they start looking around and they realize, well, wait a second, if Israel is going to continue on violating every international law in the book, targeting Syria, targeting Lebanon, then what's to stop them from targeting the rest of the region and trying really wholeheartedly to build the greater Israel that we have all been warned about? So will they wake up to that? A lot of that remains to be seen. But the writing is on the wall. The evidence is there. Now is a good time for them to start realizing what greater Israel actually is and how it is intended to come about.
Rachel, before we finish up, so how do you see, speaking about Syria, how do you see the Russia-Ukraine war ending? And is there anything else you would like to say?
Yeah, when it comes to the situation in Ukraine, this has very much been a war of attrition, right? We're not seeing anything happen speedily. And I know for some in the Western media, they look at this and they go, okay, we're seeing Russia make gains on its end slowly but surely. And I think that has been Russia's kind of strategy in all of this, right? They have made their way through this slowly but surely. They are focusing on the Donbass region. They are focusing on, exactly as they said back in 2022, trying to root out, trying to denazify Ukraine. And that is their goal, as they are going up against not just the Ukrainian military, but all of these other far-right extremist neo-Nazi battalions like the Azov battalion that has been brought in and kind of grafted into the Ukrainian military. When it comes to talks about a possible peace a possible peace agreement, I know that is something that Trump really wants, right? Going back to him being a businessman, wanting to come in and say, okay, I fixed this, I solved this conflict. I'm curious to see what Russia is willing to agree to, because as we've seen time and time again, when there is an agreement like the Minsk Accords, where Kiev says that they'll do one thing, they make these promises, well, they have used that to buy time to continue allowing the West to arm their military to prepare for a future fight against Russia. And everything we've seen from these, anonymous Trump-related sources are that they would be proposing some kind of a frozen conflict at the current lines. Well, exactly as we just saw in Syria, if a conflict is frozen, it can become unfrozen at any time, and it will eventually become unfrozen at some point. So for Russia, the position that they're in, where they are currently winning this war, right? They are achieving the objectives that they set out. Given the position that they're in, I would doubt that they would agree to some kind of frozen conflict scenario that puts them in a position of having to fight this same war, even if it's 10, 20 years down the road. I don't think that they would do that. I could be surprised, right? I have been surprised by some of the latest updates, but at the same time, I also think that Russia, they could very well engage in talks, come to the table, say, hey, we've made our demands very clear, just as Russian President Putin was reported to have said when he talked to Germany's Olaf Scholz a few weeks ago, where they did have that phone call, and Putin said, look, my demands have been made very public. You know what they are. When you're ready to come to the table, when you're ready to meet those demands, then we can talk. I could very well see a version of that coming from Russia, but I don't think that there is going to be any, magical end to this conflict where we tie everything up in a bow. I think it's likely to keep going, and it'll be interesting to see what the West decides to do, because we've seen a lot of talk coming from members of the NATO alliance about NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. And obviously, as we saw in France, when you start bringing that up, the public says, absolutely not. We are not going to fight and die in a war for Kiev and for its Western backers. But it'll be interesting to see how much of that comes up, how much the West is willing to give, because right now they are keeping Kiev on life support, and that life support only lasts for so long. So I'm very curious to see where this goes. I don't think it'll be over anytime soon. I think this is going to be one of those forever wars that we continue to cover for a while here. But I am very curious to see what is said, what the Trump administration tries to propose, and then, of course, what NATO decides to do when it comes to their support of Kiev, because I don't see them just magically cutting it off, but at the same time, I don't know how they could really step it up and provide infinitely more support. And with Kiev's manpower shortages that they have right now, you can give them all the weapons that you want, but you are not providing the manpower that they currently need. So a lot on the table there that is still kind of unfolding, and it'll also be interesting to see how much that kind of comes up in headlines, how much that makes news, as we still have so much going on in the Middle East. I don't think that we will have any shortage of things to talk about, but I appreciate you having me on your show and letting me rant away about all of the things going on in the world right now.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure to have you, Rachel. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so I am on Substack. That is probably my main platform, rachelblevins.substack.com. I'm also on X. I've got a Patreon, YouTube for as long as they'll have me, Rumble, about any alternative video platform that is out there that you can think of. If you'll just search Rachel Blevins, you'll probably find my profile. And yeah, I would encourage people, if they want to follow along. I usually put out regular videos throughout the week of both myself just ranting away about the news of the day, and I also do a lot of interviews and talk to other journalists and analysts kind of all over the world. So if people want to, they can check that out.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure to have you, Rachel. We should definitely do another show in the future if you're interested too. It should be great. It was a pleasure to have you. Absolutely, thank you for coming on my show. I just want to say to everybody, make sure you go check out Rachel Blevins' work. She's a fantastic journalist, does absolutely fantastic interviews on her channel. Please remember, go follow her on Twitter, go check out her YouTube channel, go give her a subscribe, give her a like and sub. And also, thank you for coming on, Rachel. It's a pleasure having you. Thank you for everyone for joining this episode of the Welsh Republic Podcast, episode 162. Take care, everybody. God bless. Remember to like and subscribe. like and share this video, and remember to subscribe, everybody. Take care. God bless you all. Stay safe.